Okay, so welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course. We are continuing our journey through Francesca Fremantle's book, Luminous, Emptiness, and we have reached chapter 11, titled The Luminosity of Death, and finally are in a direct discussion of the Liberation Through Hearing, or Tibetan Book of the Dead. I'd say the subtext to all of this, or at least everything I'm going to present tonight, is why meditation is a really good idea. But that really is at the heart of almost every talk you could possibly give. But in this particular context, with the bardo of dying, which is what this chapter is about, begins with the final illness or injury that brings about actual physical death, and culminates in the experience of the dawning of luminosity. The more familiar we are with the luminous nature of our mind, which we develop and experience through meditation practice, the more likely it is that we'll recognize luminosity when it occurs after death. So it's not that this is particularly a goal that we fixate on in meditation practice, but if we meditate properly, if we're able to really relax, let go, recognize mind's true nature, then when the dawning of luminosity occurs after our death, we'll be able to recognize, rest fully in oneness with that experience. So ultimately that's what we'll be talking about tonight. I wanted to say just a little bit more too about the notion of, I actually have a lot of things I could talk about tonight, so we'll see where this goes. I have pieces of things all around me, so if I look like I'm juggling at times, I probably am, because there's a lot of different things that I thought might be helpful to share. The text begins with chapter 11. The author says, we now look at the text in light of the background material presented, and notes that the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Liberation Through Hearing, begins with praise and devotion to the Trikaya. The Trikaya is the Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya, which we talked about before. She presented this material in the chapter titled The Threefold Process of the Path, chapter 8 maybe. But I thought it would be helpful just to review just a little bit what the Trikaya is. And as a matter of fact, as a suggestion, if people are interested, I'd really recommend reading Trungpa Rinpoche's commentary in the Bodhisattva Path of Compassion and Wisdom, the second of the three Profound Treasury volumes, where he talks about the slogan, seeing confusion as the four kayas is the unsurpassable shunyata protection. I think if you were to meditate for 5 or 10 minutes, then read that chapter, and then perhaps contemplate and meditate again, it begins to really give a good idea, because he describes it very well in terms of meditation practice. And I just want to say a little about, repeat a little bit of what he says there. So this is on page 324 of the second volume of the Profound Treasury. He says, this slogan, seeing confusion as the four kayas is unsurpassable shunyata protection. This slogan is about how to carry everything onto the path at the absolute bodhicitta level. It is based on understanding your mind by studying and watching yourself, and by practicing shamatha and vipassana meditation. By practicing those disciplines, you begin to realize that the essence of your mind is empty, that the nature of your mind is light and clear, and that the expression or manifestation of your mind is active. That realization can only come about when you've developed mindfulness and awareness. Only on the meditation cushions can you see that your mind has no origin. You see that there is no place from which thoughts arise, and you have no idea where thoughts go. Furthermore, you have no idea where thoughts actually dwell. Thoughts just arrive and vanish, they disappear. According to this slogan, perception has 4 stages. First, there is waiting or openness. Then there may be uncertainty as how to perceive things, and you do not know how to make a particular situation graspable. Second, you develop a clear idea of the situation and how to organize things. Third, you begin to make a relationship between those two things. Finally, you have a total experience of the whole. Those are the four states of mind or mental processes we go through. Those four processes are related with what are called the four kayas: Dharmakaya, Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Swabhavakaya. The Dharmakaya aspect is basic openness. The second stage is clarity. And then the third stage is actual activity. So these are the three kayas, and that's what the Book of the Dead opens with, a expression of, again, praise and devotion to the Dharmakaya. Particularly Amitabha, infinite light, is the Dharmakaya. Peaceful and wrathful lotus deities, the Sambhogakaya. Pamakara, or Pamasambhava, incarnate as the protector of beings. Homage to the Guru, the three kayas. So this, as she says, this sets the scene, that although the teachings deals with death, the most feared eventuality of our existence, it's pervaded by infinite love and compassion of the awakened state, which is manifested or exemplified by Amitabha, who's the embodiment of compassion, and which is expressed as boundless light. Boundless light is actually a literal translation of Amitabha. And she says that a lot of death practices are connected with Amitabha, in particular Pure Land practice, the idea of seeking rebirth in a Pure Land where practice and study of the Dharma is easy, and where attaining enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings is more readily done. Amitabha's Pure Land is called Sukhavati, and a lot of practices are built around this notion of Amitabha's infinite compassion, infinite warmth, and the possibility of rebirth in a Pure Land. It's also, she says, connected with another emanation of Amitabha, Amitayas, which is connected with longevity and long life. Amitayas means infinite light rather than boundless light. But as she says, the inner meaning of Amitayas practices is such practices to attain the state of awareness that transcends the very idea, the very concepts of life and death. So Amitabha represents the Dharmakaya. In this respect, represents the central place of compassion and warmth. That the Dharmakaya, again, is the formless aspect of the Guru, open ground, open space. And since it's the innermost essence of all beings, it's the universal Guru in the ultimate sense, the infinite light dwelling in the heart of all beings. And then we have the Sambhogakaya, which is represented in the Bardo of Dharmata by the mandala of peaceful and wrathful deities emanating from Amitabha. The Sambhogakaya relates to the notion of, as she says, of communication and inspiration and transmission, energetic level, the connection between the boundless open state of Dharmakaya and the form state of the Nirmanakaya. And she says it's the very nature of the Guru principle. Sometimes the Sambhogakaya form of the Buddha is called the enjoyment body, and I think this quote from the text kind of gives an idea why that might be. When the minds of the teacher and student meet and become one, everything is seen with the eyes of sacred vision. The entire world becomes a mandala of deities, arising spontaneously as the expression of the Guru's mind. Or as Trungpa Rinpoche writes, and this is from the Sadhana Mahamudra, the whole of that existence is freed and becomes the Guru. In other words, every experience becomes an experience of wakefulness. Every experience that we have, any sense, perception, any thought, any emotion, could bring about or could be a reminder of the awakened state. That when this happens, we have moments of openness. We're free of fixed mind, and there's the clarity, vividness, freshness, sense of well-being, and the simplicity of the awakened state just comes to us. So with the Sambhogakaya, it's not that we actually see deities, although some people do if they reach a level where they're capable of doing that, but that we have this experience of open mind, of clarity. And then Padmakara represents the Nirmanakaya. This is the body that we can relate to, the Guru in human form. And he's called the protector of all beings because he possesses the supreme power of dispelling their illusions and awakening them to their own true nature. In the same way, going back to the Lojong slogan, when we're able to understand something of the three kayas, then shunyata becomes protection because it cuts through the solidity of our beliefs and allows us to open up. It allows us to let go into our true nature. So Trungpa Rinpoche described the life and teachings of Padmasambhava Padmakara as a living expression of the Trikaya, the sense of totality and spaciousness of the Dharmakaya, the energy and play of the Sambhogakaya, and the very practical activity of the Nirmanakaya. So the Trikaya principle lies at the heart of liberation through hearing, which we're about to explore. And again, this is because it's going over this because it's important to see that the notion of the Trikaya is not something external or foreign to us, which is why, in particular, as Trungpa Rinpoche describes, we can experience this very directly and very simply in meditation practice. When we're able to let go, when we're able to just let thoughts dissolve, when we're able to experience at least moments of clarity, well-being, simplicity, and just simply being present. And it's through experiencing those, again, that we develop the familiarity and the confidence in our true nature that when we do experience the dawning of luminosity in the bardo, we're able to recognize it fully. And it's in the tantric text, it said that what we practice in through meditation is child luminosity, and then the meeting with luminosity in the bardo is the mother luminosity, which is our true nature, and that mother and child just unite naturally. So that's, again, the importance of meditation practice. So in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Liberation Through Hearing, really is concerned with 3 of the 6 bardos that we've talked about. The bardo of dying, or as Andrew Holichek calls it, the painful bardo of dying, which we'll talk about in a little while. The bardo of dharmata, and the bardo of existence, as Francesca Fremantle calls it, more commonly the bardo of becoming, where we seek rebirth, seek again some kind of solidification into a body. And as she says, it's the real purpose of this book, it's a quote directly from Luminous Emptiness, the text we read, its real purpose is to provide guidance during the further stages of the after-death experience. And I thought for that it would be helpful just to read an excerpt from the Book of the Dead, just to give a sense of what this kind of guidance is. So there are all different things that, the idea is that as someone dies and after they die, that a guru or a fellow practitioner would actually read portions of this text. And there are certain parts that are read at different times, different experiences. But just as an example, O son of noble family, that which is called death has now arrived, so you should adopt this attitude. I have arrived at the time of death, so now, by means of this death, I will adopt only the attitude of the enlightened state of mind, friendliness and compassion, and attain perfect enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings as limitless as space. With this attitude, at this special time, for the sake of all sentient beings, I will recognize the luminosity of death as the Dharmakaya, and attaining in that state the supreme realization of Mahamudra, I will act for the good of all beings. If I do not attain this, I will recognize the Bardo state as it is, and attaining the great indivisible Mahamudra form of the Bardo, I will act for the good of all beings, as limitless as space, in whatever way will influence them. Without letting go of this attitude, you should remember and practice whatever meditation teaching you have received in the past. So there's moments like that throughout this text, where there's things that are literally read to provide guidance to the dying and dead person as to what they might recognize, reminders that what they experience is the reflection of their mind, reminders of their practice, reminders of their guru, reminders of compassion. So it really is, its real purpose, as she says, is to provide guidance. She says the bardo of dying is can be very brief. The description, sorry, that the part of the Book of the Dead, or Liberation Through Hearing, that talks about the bardo of dying is very brief and not as clear as the book really focuses on the bardo of dharmata and the bardo of becoming. But it does talk about as well about the bardo of dying. As she says, it's less clear, a quote, as though the reader is expected to be able to fill in the gaps with additional information. And she says there are other teachings that actually relate to the process of dying, such as a text called Self-Liberation Through the Signs and Omens of Death. So literally, this bardo means the time of death, the whole process of dying, starting with the final illness or injury that is going to kill a person. Kill us, you, me, whatever. That's the direct cause of death, up to the moment when the most subtle aspect of mind and life force leaves the body. And she says some explanations just focus on the final moment when the mind enters the state of luminosity and has the possibility of complete liberation. If we recognize our luminous nature as not separate from us, not an external experience, but who or what we truly are in our most fundamental nature. Then there's liberation at that point. But she says Trungpa Rinpoche approached it in this way, that it's just mainly the bardo right before death. And again, the purpose of this, in the bardo of dying, we're encouraged to be aware that we're dying so that we can let go and not be shocked by death. So everything that she presents in terms of the various stages of death and dying is really to help us be less afraid and more able to recognize and relax into what's happening. As she says, she provides a reminder, which we've talked about before, that Buddhism regards the whole of our existence as a succession of births and deaths, from day to day, from life to life, moment to moment. And so if we just stop for a moment and think about that, think about what we might have been doing this morning, what we might have been doing yesterday, what we might have been doing 5 years ago, what we might have been doing as children, then we realize that there really is a constant process of change, death, dying, and rebirth, not as dramatic as the actual death of our physical body, but that there's a constant process of change throughout our life, and that we don't see it that way. We don't see our experience as one of constant deaths and rebirths, so to speak, constant change, constant impermanence. Because we tend to relate to so much of life through conceptual mind and with labels, and what in some texts is called, what's called continua. So an example of that is, taking from Zigar Kongtrul Rinpoche, is that we might say that we crossed a river to drive somewhere, and then a day later drove back over that river. And even though we think it's the same thing, in fact, the river that we're crossing over is entirely different. It's in constant change, and that it's a concept or a label to think of it as being the same thing. And in one sense, on a relative level, it is. I mean, it makes sense. But in another way, not a molecule of water is the same from one moment. It's a process of constant change. And in the same way, we're fooled by continua of our existence into thinking that it's more continuous and solid than it actually is. Which is why this idea of regarding our whole existence as a succession of births and deaths we really need to stop and think about it for a moment. But if we look at our actual experience in meditation practice, or just reflect on our life, that the feelings, perceptions, thoughts, our goals, what we think is important, everything is always changing from moment to moment. And we can see this by just allowing ourselves to slow down and look. And the more we're able to do that, the more we'll be able to begin to let go of a sense of solidity, of identity around ego. Anyway, the conditions of each life, as she says, going back to the text. So again, this moment of this, regarding our whole existence as a succession of births and deaths. The conditions of each life are determined by, as she says, karmic forces set in motion by the previous life. And we can see this sometimes in our life. We have an argument with someone and walk away frustrated or angry and then do something else that leads to some other result. And we can kind of see how one moment influences the next and the next. As she says, though, there are innumerable influences that work with our mind streams. In other words, causes and conditions are infinite. Very important sentence. Our state of mind during the last moments before death is particularly important in deciding the direction our future will take. Our state of mind at the moment of death has a lot of influence on what will happen to us in the bardo. So this is why we want to prepare. This is why the material that follows in this text and in the Book of the Dead about the stages of dying is relevant, so that we can recognize that we're dying, and so that we can begin to let go, so that we can have some trust that there's some wisdom in the body's processes, even though from an ego's point of view, it's the most unwanted thing we can imagine. This is why Trungpa Rinpoche emphasized the importance of that the dying person know that they're dying, that this kind of communication is so important, that the person knows that they're dying. Why it's important, if possible, that the environment around the dying person be as peaceful and without dissension as possible, that we make it as easy as possible, or for ourselves for that matter, to be able to let go without resentment, aggression, fear, and grasping, as best we can. As she says, there are different types of karma. She talks about heavy karma, but the karma of the period just before death, our final thoughts, words, and deeds, is very significant, most significant. As she says, if we are fortunate enough to live in a culture where the approach of death is accepted and acknowledged as a great opportunity, or if we have friends with that attitude who will support us, our natural fear of dying can be transformed into a source of inspiration. And she says, in Buddhist countries, it's considered a great blessing to know in advance of our impending death. So, as she says, before we actually look into the instructions given in the text, not the Book of the Dead, but the self-liberation through science and omens of death, let's look at the actual process of dying. So, I'll reorganize myself for just a moment. Dying, as she says, is the process of dissolving from the densest and heaviest to the finest and most subtle levels of our being. And possibly the most noticeable aspect of this is the dissolution of the elements, earth into water, water into fire, fire into air. And sometimes it's air into consciousness and then into space, along with the dissolution of states or mind. She says, as this dissolution process occurs, all our vital energies or prana returns to its source. It's absorbed into the central nadi, the avadhuti, and then into the indestructible bindu at the heart, at the center of the heart. We've talked about the indestructible bindu, and she talked about subtle body a couple chapters back. Now we're beginning to see how all that background material starts to come together. As she says, one by one, the 5 primary and secondary pranas withdraw. These are the different winds. Remember, there was an ascending wind, a descending wind, and these all descending wind, and these all relate to different bodily functions. And all of these things begin to wane, disintegrate, come apart. The elements dissolve, and as a result, bodily functions and the senses begin to fail. She talks about Trungpa Rinpoche explaining the dying process in terms of the uncertainty, fear, and confusion we experience as we go through the process of dissolution. And you can see why this would be terrifying. It's what the foundation of, at least from an ego point of view, what we think we and our world is. And now it starts coming apart. As she quotes Trungpa Rinpoche, we leave behind the real, solid, dualistic world of the living, or at least seemingly real, solid world, and enter the ghostly world of the dead. And she says this actually applies to the continual occurrence of dissolution in everyday life. So sometimes this is clearer to us and others, especially if we're doing something that where there's a real significant change in our life. If we're leaving a job, if we're moving from one place to another, for visiting family and then leaving. We just have moments of this kind of dissolution. Not obviously not on the level of actual dying, but there is this sense of things coming apart, of letting go, of things seeming definite and real, and then suddenly becoming more illusory, ghostly, ghost-like, or whatever. Where we look at just, even as he said in the reading on that I briefly on the four kayas and shunyata protection, where do these thoughts and feelings go? And we realize how really ungraspable what seems so solid actually is. In any case, as she points out in the text, our experience of this life, from an ego point of view at least, is based on duality, the subject-object, good and bad, pleasure and pain. And all of this is what begins to dissolve. As she says, we're programmed this way by the skandhas, or by our attachment to the skandhas. So this mode of experience, duality, is what we consider to be real. But as the elements dissolve at death, this whole structure on which our dualistic perceptions of self and other, self and the world, begins to crumble away, begins to fall apart. As the senses deteriorate, sight, sound, and so on, as the senses deteriorate, the boundary between inside and outside that preserves our identity becomes tenuous, confused, distorted, and ultimately breaks down completely. And she says that even in the echoes of these experiences that occur during life, in other words, there are times when we might have some experience of something like this, of suddenly realizing the real fluidity and lack of solidity of things that we take to be so solid and real. We can feel equally lost and bewildered. We may begin to doubt our existence and fear we're losing our sanity. And at different points in time, it's often pointed out that our sense of reality is more tenuous than we often think. I always think, in this regard, I would think of R.D. Laing's quote that we're all just a few degrees Fahrenheit away from insanity. If you ever had a really high fever, you know exactly what he means. Yet at the same time that this is happening, and there's all obviously intense fear, intense anxiety, intense terror, as things begin to dissolve. At the same time, the loss of ego that's forced on us presents us with continual opportunities to let go into clear, open space until we reach the luminosity of our basic nature. So again, that's why recognition of what's happening and the ability to rest in awareness and our familiarity with resting in awareness, which is, again, why meditation practice is so important. This is why this is so important at this point. She says that here that the problem doesn't lie in duality itself. It lies in the fact that we experience duality in an incomplete and biased manner. By biased, she means that we relate to things in terms of passion, aggression, and ignorance, or passion, aggression, and delusion. It's not that there are things in the world that we ourselves, it's that we relate to things as being real in a way that they're not. And she actually quotes Trungpa Rinpoche from his commentary in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But I actually looked at the quote, and she only quotes part of it, and I'm going to read the whole thing because I think it might make it a little bit more sensible. So this is Trungpa Rinpoche. We could say that the real world is that in which we experience pain and pleasure, good and bad. There is some active intelligence which provides the criteria of things as they are, a basic dualistic notion. But if we are completely in touch with these dualistic feelings, that absolute experience of duality is itself the experience of non-duality, then there is no problem at all, because duality is seen from a perfectly open and clear point of view, in which there is no conflict. There is a tremendous encompassing vision of oneness. So this isn't a conceptually created sense of oneness, but it's actually direct experience. It doesn't mean that everything is the same. There's a tremendous variety of occurrences, within the oneness of awareness. This is just what it means in the lineage chant that we do in describing the Dharmakaya. Nothing, whatever, yet everything arises from it. In other words, when we're able to rest in the true nature of mind, then whatever occurs is seen as mind. And yes, there are a variety of different appearances, infinite variety of appearances, but they're all recognized as a display of awareness. And it's only when we start dividing things up in a biased way, I want this, I don't want that, I want to protect myself, and whatever it is, passion, aggression, delusion, that's when duality becomes a real problem. It becomes confusing, and we end up in struggle and distortion. She quotes from, again, through this text that she's using to describe the dying process, self-liberation through the signs and omens of death. Quote, appearances are not mistaken. Error comes through grasping. Knowing the grasping thought as mind, it is self-liberated. So again, it's seeing whatever occurs as a display of mind and not grasping. It's similar again to Tilopa's instruction to Naropa. It's not appearances that bind you, it's your attachment to appearances that binds you. And that's what we're meant to let go of, which is really a pretty tall order because we're quite habituated to taking things as real and grasping after them. In any case, as she says, by learning to see the world in such a way, we can experience duality as it really is, fully and completely, so that it's transformed into the all-embracing totality of the awakened state. So within the empty oneness of the awakened state, all things can appear because mind is unbound. Empty, ungraspable. The practitioner who has stabilized this realization is able to view with equanimity the disintegration of the body and coarse levels of mind, confident in the natural innate state of luminosity and emptiness. So another way of saying this is we're encouraged to rest in our rigpa, our ordinary mind, the true nature of our, this is what's being talked about here. With this, I actually wanted to, I was remembering a quote that the 16th Karmapa, who died in 1980 or 81, in talking about death, said nothing happens. And so I looked this up, and I want to quote a couple of authors. First, Andrew Holacek, in regard, again, to preparing for death and approaching the bardo of dying. He says, any meditation that allows you to become familiar with your mind will prepare you for death. In the bardos, we're forced to relate to our mind simply because there's nothing else. Outer world is gone, body is gone, so mind becomes reality. Through insight meditation, we discover that whatever arises in the bardo is just the display of our mind. That recognition sets us free. So by exploring the depths of our mind in meditation, we're preparing for what happens after death. If you spiritually die, or rather transcend your false sense of self before you're forced to do so at death, then when you physically die at the end of this life, you will not die because you're already dead, in a sense. You've already died to your limited sense of self, or ego. Releasing our grip is what transforms the painful bardo of dying into simply the bardo of dying. The 16th Karmapa, who is said to be an enlightened being, said that nothing happens at death. The Karmapa is the head of the Karmakagyu, one of the four major schools of Tibetan Buddhism. Nothing happens. This was a cryptic statement left open for interpretation. One view would be that for someone who has completely let go during life, nothing happens at death because there's nothing left to release. Bardos only exist in samsara, which is defined by grasping and attachment. It is said in the teachings that for someone like the Karmapa, there is no bardo. And then a different author, who also quoted the Karmapa, and as well Suzuki Roshi, who is a Zen practitioner, who in his book Not Always So says, don't worry about dying, nothing is going to happen. Well, this is the kind of out there statement that skeptics of Buddhism point to as a way of discrediting it. Of course something happens, they say, you die. That's something, isn't it? Clearly Suzuki Roshi and the Karmapa were talking about dying at a different level. Of course they knew that dying is something. In fact, Suzuki Roshi said in Zen Mind Beginner's Mind, body and mind will both have their end. The body dies, individuality dies, but there is an aspect, let's not even call it a something, that's always been there, that will always be there. And that aspect, that is the true nature of our mind. And that transcends physical death. That's why Pulmop Rinpoche's book is called Mind Beyond Death. And that's when, if we're able to let go and recognize fully, then, in a sense, nothing happens when we die. Even though at the same time, the most catastrophic thing from the point of ego is happening. But again, so to go back to dissolution, she says that this process of dissolution, this is all just how we might be able to approach dissolution, how we might be able to approach the stages of dying. As she says, this can be observed in outward changes in the body and inner sensations experienced by the dying person. As one becomes increasingly disconnected from the external world, awareness of internal states grows stronger. It's kind of like what Andrew Holacek was saying, that with the Bardos, we're forced to deal with mind because mind is gone, the world is gone, all that's left is mind. And that with the dissolution of the coarse elements and the body, there are also secret signs, the appearances of light within the mind that most people don't recognize or don't recognize the significance of. But these indicate that as the coarser levels of our being dissolve, the subtler levels become manifest, until the most subtle essence is revealed. As she says, the dissolutions can be slow or quick. When there's sudden death, they can be just instantaneous, that they may overlap somewhat. But that it's very helpful to become accustomed to the general pattern of events so as to prepare and lessen the fear of dying. So the first is the dissolving of the earth element, and this relates to the coming apart of the chakra at the navel. With this, in terms of an outer sign or a physical experience, with each one of these, there's an intensification of the element and then it dissolves. So the intensification of the earth element is a growing sense of heaviness. And then this is followed by a loss of physical strength and agility, there's diminishing size and weight. And with this, the mind feels heavy and listless. Visual perception begins to dim, because it's connected also with the dissolving of the eye consciousness. And the secret sign that she talks about is the appearance of mirage-like appearances. So this is the first, this is the first stage of dissolution, earth into water, where the solidity of the body begins to dissolve, begins to break down. With the dissolution of water into fire, the heart chakra breaks down. But in terms of the outer sign, which I think is the most easily noticeable thing, that the body begins to dry up, there's increasing thirst, and then there's leakage of bodily fluids. Mentally, there's a progressive loss of mental clarity. The mind may become agitated and susceptible to confusion. And with the secret sign, there's the beginning of smoke-like appearances. It's a hazy, smoky thing. I should also say that each one of these is connected with a different skandha. So the earth element is connected with form. So with this, again, with the breaking down of the earth element, there's an increasing feeling of shakiness, unstable, uncertain, loss of sense of ground. And we can experience this in life as just a sense of groundlessness, that, especially when we go through a big change, when moving from one place to another, one job to another, relationship to another, a real sense of groundlessness, things coming apart. Again, water into fire, fire into wind, or fire into air. This is connected with the throat chakra. But the outer sign, which again I think is what most people are most familiar with, most clearly experience, is loss of bodily heat beginning at the extremities. First, there might be a sense of, again, an intensification of feeling hot and feverish, but then there's a sense of being cold. The clarity of mind fluctuates between being clear and unclear. With this, there's an increasing inability to recognize people or perceive objects distinctly. And the secret sign, which is again a sign of the emergence of luminosity, is the appearance of like sparks or like fireflies, it's said. As wind or the wind element dissolves into consciousness, there can be increasing, in terms of a physical sign, there's some difficulty breathing, or the breath becomes more labored and difficult. Exhalations become longer. Until finally there's actually a cessation of outer respiration, which from a Western traditional medical point of view is actually the moment of death. With this, the mind becomes extremely confused and unstable. There can be hallucinations, very vivid thought states. But the secret sign is more of the appearance of like a brightly shining torch. So with this, earth into water, water into fire, fire into air, and then air or wind, and wind into consciousness. Gradual dissolution from solid to subtler and subtler elements. With the dissolving of wind into space or consciousness, it's this extreme dissociation and sense of disembodiment. And she says all of these experiences of dissolution, from the first feeling of losing one's ground to the sensation of disembodiment, are part of the inevitable natural decay of our ego-centered material nature. At the same time, the secret signs appear into the mind that is trained to recognize them, reveal the ever closer approach to our luminous spiritual nature. So, when the dissolution of the four outer elements is complete, consciousness dissolves into space, which you could say is the dimension of unbounded openness and emptiness. The final chakra, the crown chakra, dissolves, and prana begins to become absorbed into the central channel, the avadhuti. Respiration ceases with a final exhalation, and externally the person now appears dead. I say externally because the subtle body, the subtle respiration still occurs. And with this begins the inner dissolution. This is much better described in Mind Beyond Death than I think it is in this text. But the basic idea is we receive a white bindu from the father, which resides at the crown chakra, and a red bindu from the mother that's at the navel, or sometimes it's said to be in the secret place below the navel. And these begin to move toward the heart center. And with this, subtler states of mind related to passion, aggression, and delusion begin to cease. So in the Nyingma tradition, this dissolve happens in 3 stages. Whereas the white bindu, which is connected with aggression in its neurotic form, the red bindu, passion, reach the heart center. So these red and white bindus merge together at the heart center and enclose the indestructible bindu, and mind experiences darkness. So that's the 3rd stage. So the 3 stages are, I think, first the white bindu and the dissolving of aggressive tendencies, then the red bindu, the dissolving of passion, and then finally they join together. There's a kind of a glowing dark. It's described as a glowing darkness, but with this, the states of mind connected with delusion or ignorance dissolve as well. And with this, consciousness dissolves into space. There's a complete loss of identity, and it's said they actually experience a period of complete blackout. And then there's the final stage, which is the dawning of luminosity. Trungpa Rinpoche describes this as a moment of utter relaxation after abandoning the struggle to maintain ego, so that luminosity presents itself naturally. But he describes the struggle to hold on to ego as like this being simultaneously being in icy cold and boiling hot water, so that pain and pleasure can't be distinguished. And with this, there's some kind of final letting go. It's the moment in which duality opens out into oneness. And if we're able to recognize the luminosity at that moment, we're enlightened on the spot. It's complete liberation. And the instruction is simply to recognize this as your own mind and rest in that awareness. It's also said that most beings, it's so brief and that it's not recognized by most beings, which is again why meditation practice is important. That the more familiar we are with the luminous nature of mind in our life here, where in one sense meditation is made easier because we are in a body, so we have something to come back to when we get distracted, and we're not we're able to settle into body, settle into the posture, which helps with settling the mind. That the more we're able to recognize the true nature of mind in our life now, in this bardo between rebirth and death, the easier it is to recognize at this moment with the dawning of luminosity. With this, there still remains an inner breath until prana leaves the body. And it says one remains in a state of recognition or of unconsciousness for anywhere from a few seconds to days and weeks. When a being who has attained some kind of realization is able to recognize this moment of luminosity, there's a state called tuktam. And there are different signs, like it said that the heart center stays warm for days after physical death, rather than becoming cold as the body normally would, because circulation has ceased. It said that this was true of the Karmapa. That you could, there's a film about him called Lion's Roar, and he interviewed Mitchell Levy, who was a physician who attended to him. And he said he wasn't surprised when the heart area was warm a day after death, but when it was warm 3 days, as he said, as a doctor, I have no explanation for this. As a practitioner, there's an explanation, which is that the subtle consciousness is still present in the body, which is why, generally speaking, it's recommended that the body be left undisturbed for 3 days after death, so that consciousness has time to leave the body, which we'll talk about in a moment. From this point of view, and so from a traditional Western point of view, death has already occurred, but from the point of view of the teachings on the Book of the Dead and the other texts that she quotes, signs and omens of death, actual death occurs when the red and white bindus separate again, releasing that indestructible bindu that's enclosed between them. And at this point, the red and white bindus continue moving in their opposite direction. So the red bindu, remember, was lower in the body, and the white bindu was at the head. So the red bindu emerges as blood at the nostrils, or a whitish drop from the sexual organs, depending on which bindu you're talking about. And that's a sign that death has taken place. And with this, the indestructible bindu itself, which he describes as the entity of indivisible, very subtle mind and prana, leaves the body by any one of 9 or 10 different exit points. If the dying person accomplishes transference, which is, again, also talked about in the beginning of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, if at this point where the dawn of luminosity, if they're able to transfer consciousness, they can eject consciousness out through the top of the head, through the Brahmarandra, the little dent at the top of the head, at the crown of the head, straight into Pure Land. Otherwise, consciousness leaves through one of the other exits in the body. It goes into the side nadis and emerges, as she says, through the nose, mouth, eyes, ears, navel, forehead, sexual organ, or anus. And with each one of these, this has some influence on the future rebirth, as well as the experience in the bardo of Dharmata. So this is why it's generally, among other things, to not interfere very much with the body, so that an exit can occur naturally, and hopefully through the top of the head or one of the other exits that's higher up, because exit through the anus or sexual organs is not supposed to be very good. So don't go that way if you have nothing else out of all of this. Don't do that. So in any case, that is what I came prepared to talk about tonight. We've covered the dissolution of the body and the dawning of Dharmata, and I think again, The reason for studying this and having some sense of this is so that when we have these experiences, we can encounter them with more equanimity and as much fearlessness and directness as we can manage, so that we can rest in the state of mind, rest in the true nature of mind, and allow the inevitability of death to occur in such a way that we can attain some kind of liberation. So with that, I don't know, John, if you had anything you wanted to add, or wanted to continue, or whatever we could do. Or people have questions, we could do that as well.
We've done about half the chapter already at 6:30, so I think we should do the other half of the chapter next week. And just, we could have a discussion. I just would like to make one comment. The Dalai Lama, some time ago, said that he studies this material regularly. Now, maybe he doesn't anymore, but this was some years ago, because he wants to be prepared at death as he goes through these experiences, so that he won't be confused or frightened, that he'll know what's happening. And so he studies this material. Frankly, I find this presentation difficult. And I think that what we may do is also, we'll finish Francesca's book and then go into the book that Michael recommended, Sugchen Punlap Rinpoche's book, Mind Beyond Death, which I think you'll find very helpful in understanding this material. I find it, there are things in Francesca's presentation that are really wonderful, and there's a lot of material in here that I find confusing, and I'm concerned about you too finding it confusing. So we could have a discussion. What do you think, Michael?
Sounds good.
We're already 2/3 of the way, more than 2/3 of the way through the hour. Class. Ed Papantonio.
Yes, Michael, thank you for very thoughtful and lucid presentation.
Ed, I cannot hear you.
There's a little, yeah.
Thank you for that great presentation. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah, somewhat
Okay,
better.
good. Yeah, what I would ask about was the indestructible Bindu, and where that's first introduced, and if you could explain a little more about what distinguishes it from other Bindus.
I mean, I could say a few things about this. I mean, this is one of the areas where I feel that Punlap Rinpoche does a better job, or helps us understand it more. The red and white Bindus have to do with male and female energy. Well, red is female, white is male. And the male supposedly resides at the top of the head, and the female down 4 finger breadths below the navel. There is a third Bindu, which is black, that resolves at the heart, and is sometimes called ignorance. In this process of dying, all 3 Bindus come together in the heart and merge. And then the indestructible Bindu, it depends on what's happening with this individual, if they are going to achieve enlightenment because they've practiced enough, or if they're going to proceed into further confusion, as most people do. If they're going to proceed into further confusion, those 3 Bindus simply migrate into the next stage of development, which is the bardo of Dharmata. And that is the first of these 3 bardos of death, is the painful bardo of dying. Yes, I forget who calls it the painful bardo of dying, but it's the bardo of dying. The second is the bardo of Dharmata, which means the bardo of reality. And the third bardo is the bardo of becoming. That is the famous 49 days in which the individual proceeds towards rebirth in a human, well, whatever realm. Could be human, animal, every ghost could be anything, depending on their karma. So for those who have achieved enough, have practiced enough in this lifetime and are going to achieve enlightenment, what happens is that instead of these bardos moving into the bardo of Dharmata and proceeding along that way, they come together in unification, these three bindus, red, white, and black. And when they do, they merge with the permanent bindu and achieve complete enlightenment. At that point, the individual ceases to exist, and instead there is reality. The individual is just a fiction, a creation of ego, you might say. And at this point, when all three of those bindus merge, there is an achievement of utter reality. I think Paul Rinpoche will explain this even better. But those are the two main possibilities at this juncture, that either the bindus merge and the individual ceases to exist as an individual and becomes basically an enlightened non-individual, or that these three bindus pass on into further confusion. Michael, do you have any more to add to that?
Not much. You described it a little bit in the chapter, The Threefold Pattern of the Path, as the very subtle level of mind. It says that it's, even less possibility of description in ordinary language. But I think when she says it's the fundamental energy of life, energy of mind, it's almost better to think of it more as energy and process rather than as like a specific thing that you could just, pull out or something. That it's more subtle than, any kind of like solid matter. But it's easy to think of it that way because it's kind of described that way. But if you want to read that section, it's on page 192, 193, where she says a little bit about it. But yeah, she acknowledges it's really difficult to say much about.
I don't want to try to pretend to be scientific here, but what we're saying conceptually is that the female component and the male component merge with an energy, and that's what basically what our consciousness is.
I think it's probably better understood as some kind of energetic process rather than as a solid thing, but that's just my stab at it.
Mm-hmm. And also, this is connected when this merger of the three with the achievement of enlightenment and no further rebirth. But if those three elements don't merge, then they move on into the next bardo, the bardo of Dharmata, and there can be enlightenment there, just as there can be enlightenment at any point. We could achieve enlightenment right now, any one of us, but it becomes easier in these bardos. In the bardo of Dharmata, the bardo of reality, the individual is seeing the energies of this world vividly, powerfully, in a way that's utterly real. And they have an increased opportunity to achieve enlightenment and dissolve the ego. Failing that, they move on into the last of the death bardos, which is the bardo of becoming, the famous so-called 49 days. And you got to remember that time does not exist in these bardos. It is even now, it's just a figment of our conceptual imagination, but especially in the bardos. And in the bardo of Dharmata, the individual supposedly moves on from that into this bardo of becoming 49 days. The first half of it, they appear as a 7-year-old child, 6 or 7 years old, as they were in their previous life. And in the last half of the 49-day bardo, they appear as the 6 or 7-year-old child they're going to be. And then supposedly, this is all the sort of the mythic or the abstract description, they will take rebirth if they're going to be reborn as a human being, while they're in that 49-day bardo, moving along as a 7-year-old child, they look down and they can see their parents copulating. And they say that if the child, this 7-year-old child, is drawn to the male, they're going to be reborn as a female. And if they're drawn to the female, they're going to be reborn as a male. That's the basic teaching. So we're going to encounter this more as we read Dunlop Rinpoche's book, which is quite good. Francesca has her talents. It's also a little confusing, I think.
Steve?
I'm not quite sure where the Pure Land fits into all of this. Can you clarify that? So, like, is it a bardo, or is it?
No.
No, it's not a bardo.
So you pass the bardos, and then you could possibly be born in the Pure Land.
Actually, if you're born in the Pure Land, you bypass the bardos. You can do it right at that. The beginning of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Liberation Through Hearing, describes that. Let me see if I can find it.
You have to understand the Pure Lands are mental states.
Okay.
It is much easier to achieve enlightenment. And this is described as being a heaven, like the classic Pure Land, and there are others, is Amitabha's, the Buddha of compassion. And he lives in the Pure Land called Sukhavati. Sukha means bliss, Avati is realm or, country, as it were. So Amitabha lives in the Pure Land of bliss. Now you have to understand that what these are mental states in which it is much more likely that you will achieve sanity and move on to complete enlightenment. Now the practice for these is constantly referred to in here, and it's a little confusing that she doesn't identify it clearly, as transference. The Tibetan for transference, and it's a very much more familiar term to me, is Powa, usually spelled P-H-O-W-A, and it refers to transference of the consciousness from one place to another, from one mind into another space. And the simplest, what happened is, the basic idea is that if you're not going to achieve complete enlightenment, you might practice transference instead. Transference will move your consciousness into a state of being that is much more likely to achieve enlightenment in the future than if you just allow yourself to be reborn. So there are different transferences. The most common and famous one is the transference into Amitabha's Pure Land of the Sukhavati. And basically what it means is that you are moving your mind into a state of being and understanding that is more conducive to achieving enlightenment in the future. So if you think, oh, I'm not going to get enlightened at death my death coming up, you might practice transference, Powa. And there are courses given in Powa by different teachers. I've never taken one. But it's warned that you don't, when you're learning Powa, you don't completely practice it to finality, to the end. Because if you do, and you're in this body, you can eject your consciousness, supposedly through the best place, you can eject it through any of the 7, I think they are, apertures: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, anus, and genitals. I don't know how many that adds up to, but the best place is to eject it through the top of the head. If you eject it through any of the others, you incur karmic results, effects. So, and you're warned when you're practicing learning Powa, don't do it all the way. Because if you do, right now, if you're being taught Powa and you actually accomplish it, You've ejected your consciousness out of your body. You're going to die, and you're not ready to die. You have to be in the right state of mind to do it. So you are learning you learn the technique for the ejection of consciousness. And there are a number of them. The most famous being the Amitabha one into Sukhavati. And again, basically what it's saying is you are changing your consciousness to make it more conducive to achieving enlightenment. Michael, I'm sorry, you went on and on.
No, I was just looking at the text. Like a lot of other things, a lot of Buddhist texts in the Nyingma tradition talks about beings at different levels of capability. So if already enlightened, don't need to, you're past all of this. It says for those who, firstly, the introduction, the means of liberating human beings. First of all, one should have studied the instructions, which should certainly liberate those of the highest capacities. They would just recognize just from reading the instructions. But if they do not, one should practice the ejection of consciousness, which liberates spontaneously as soon as it's thought of in the bardo of the moment before death. And then if that doesn't, so each one is like, all right, if they weren't able to reach some kind of realization at this point, then at the next point, this is what you can do. So the Book of the Dead is really just mentions ejection of consciousness, or POA, at the very beginning. And most of the instructions are people who are unable or unsuccessful at doing that practice. What they can do at recognizing the dharmata, the dawning of luminosity, what they can do to recognize the peaceful and wrathful deities is essentially the nature of one's own mind, so not be overwhelmed or terrified by the appearances, but actually can work with their mind at that point toward liberation. Same with the bardo of becoming, or bardo of existence, as she calls it. How to obtain, if you're going to be reborn, how to obtain the best rebirth that you can obtain. Again, so that ultimately you can attain enlightenment.
Thank you so much.
I think you need to keep in mind that up to this point in this class, we've been basically studying how to live a good life, an enlightened life, proceeding on the path. These teachings are, especially the teachings about POA, which is usually is translated as transference, are about how to die and what to do with your mind and your body at the moment of and after death in order to have the best outcome. Xinyi.
Thank you, John and Michael. That's a very good presentation and very helpful. Just want to add something about Pure Land, particularly Sukhavati. So this is just extra information because in China and other parts like Tibet or other parts of Asia, there's the Pure Land school. So a lot of the Mahayana tradition, like Buddhists were Mahayana practitioners, they don't practice transference, but they're also able to go to the Pure Land of Sukhavati. And there's like a host of teachings on this. There's several sutras, which are words of the Buddhas on this as well. And from my understanding, it's not particularly difficult to go to the Pure Land of Sukhavati. It's made particularly easy because of the aspiration of Amitabha. And there's said to be 4 causes. So the first one being kind of remembering Amitabha and, kind of making a wish to go there. Second one being accumulating merit and purifying obscurations and your karma. The third one being having bodhicitta, doing this for the sake of sentient beings. And the last one being making the aspiration and dedicating the merit to go to Sukhavati. So, yeah, so I kind of try to remember that because it's kind of the easier way. So if I die right now, maybe that's where I would go because I don't have any other special techniques. But anyways.
No,
just,
aspiration is very important in the Mahayana. There's a lot of power to that kind of aspiration, especially the aspiration to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And again, the four sentient beings, this one teaches that it's not that that's an afterthought. That's the determination that you have is for the benefit of sentient beings.
Trungpa Rinpoche never
Mission.
taught these practices relating to Sukhavati and transference, Pawa, transference of consciousness, which is why I think Michael and I, are getting all of our information from this reading. There are other teachers who do teach these, and I've always understood that there are a number of heavens in addition to Sukhavati. Sukhavati is the most accessible, easily accessible of the heavens. But what these heavens are states of mind and being which are more conducive to treading the path and ultimately achieving enlightenment. That's the way I've always understood it. But again, I'm certainly not an expert on the Pure Lands and the Buddhas who inspire them. Amitabha's Pure Land is the most accessible and the most popular. Maya.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, are there people that have meditated and reached these places through meditation to visit while being in this world?
Again, these are states of mind and understanding. You can see right now, each one of us sees the world, supposedly the same world, right? Differently. There could be a person who sees it as an absolute hellhole, sitting right next to a person who sees it as a blissful heaven. Right? So these states, like the Sukhavati's, are really ways of seeing your life in a way that is more conducive to achieving enlightenment and waking up from ignorance. Because that's my understanding.
So you could achieve that state of mind at any point in time
Yes.
with the right conditions and processes. Well,
You're asking if we could achieve this state of mind what?
like here, like before death.
I think it takes some training. But
Mm.
I haven't gone down that path
Mm.
personally. Does anybody here know more about it? Michael?
No, I was thinking of something else in response to your question. I think, beings who attain a certain level of realization do have some access. Like Trungpa Rinpoche had visions of Shambhala, and Shambhala is in itself a type of Pure Land, I guess. It's an enlightened kingdom, and it's interesting. It's actually quite traditional. At one time, Shambhala is said to be ruled over by a series of kings called Rigdons. And at one time, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston had a display of Tibetan tankas that were 300 or 400 years old of the different Rigdons. So this is, but I think for all of us, it's probably more helpful to stay in a more practical level and just deal with our minds as we have experienced them now. And if such things occur, then. But yeah, I think that for some beings, they're able to experience things that are not perceptible to us.
I think, in my understanding, surely that must be the case, as well as how would we know about these teachings?
It's a little hard to hear you.
Like
So,
I,
Can't hear you.
yes, it's a little hard to hear.
okay, is this better?
Yes.
Yes.
I'll just speak louder. In my understanding, how would we come to the conclusion of these teachings of these places without that, without either maybe the Buddha visiting or something like that?
I'm not understanding your question.
Yeah,
Like, how would the knowledge of these of this state of mind, how would the knowledge of that come about without a meditator, let's say, experiencing that? Like,
You need to find a
how
teacher.
does it?
You need to find a teacher who can guide you into these experiences if you want to proceed down this path, the path
Right.
of the Pure Lands. And as I say, there's more than one Pure Land and more than one. The Amitabha and Sukhavati is simply the most famous, and in fact, a whole school, huge school, developed around that. But there are others.
Mm.
I was going to say it's clear in the Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings, for that matter, that if we're able to reach a place where we're able to let go of fixed mind and all of the confused mind, that there are things that become available to us on the Sambhogakaya level that we're not able to recognize at this point. But it's not something you can attain as a goal, because that would actually get you farther away from it, I think. It's more that as we're able to relax and let go, we just become more open to more things.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no, Michael, you're muted.
And again, I do recommend, if you, just to help understand something of the Trikaya principle, looking at Trungpa Rinpoche's commentary on that one slogan in the second volume of the Profound Treasury. Is to really think of it as, really meditate, read just that one reading about the Trikaya, actually about the four Kayas, because the Svabhavakaya is the unity of the three, because he really brings it down to practical experience. And I think it's easy to think of some of these things as being out there somewhere or really obscure and hidden. And in fact, as he makes it really clear, it's quite accessible in meditation practice, at least, if we just look at our actual experience.
This is on page 324 of the volume 2.
Yeah, 324 and it's 325 and I think 326. Seeing confusion as the four kayas is unsurpassable shunyata protection. Anyway, so we should close with the dedication of the merit accumulated through our practice and study for the benefit of all sentient beings. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom, may the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled, may all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Michael. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Night.
Hi.
We have discussion group tomorrow if you want.
Version. Okay, thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
That was a tough one, Michael. Good job. Good job.
Thank you. Yeah, you never know what's going to come up, and
So I'll do the rest of the chapter next week, huh?
okay, yeah, we should stop recording. Yeah,
Oh, yes. Let's stop recording.
you can